this is Mesh and welcome to a theories video for WestWorld. This theory will contain spoilers from Season 2, Episode 1, all the way up to Season 2, Episode 6. So if you've not watched up to Episode 6 yet, spoilers are ahead. There were so many points to Episode 6 to talk about, but now we're past that midway of the season. I think we can now really delve into and start making big assumptions and wild accusations about the entire season as a whole. Sounds pretty fun. So let's begin. So the main theory for me that has been the biggest question mark of Season 2 so far, the idea that Bernard has been recreated unknowingly to himself, and in addition that Bernard host may now be integrated with an Arnold consciousness, but somehow with Bernard's memories. So let's take this theory back to episode 1 of season 2. I'll detail out some points that I've picked up and other people have mentioned also. So what we know and what we've seen so far with season 2 and Bernard. So let's start with episode 1. The main point here was Bernard waking up on the beach. I'll call this as well the Carl Strand timeline, just so it's easy to reference this particular timeline. So Bernard having seemingly very little memory of previous events waking up from that beach. A very symbolic location as well on the beach, a pivotal point for Ford's story, a beginning, a rebirth if you will. So throughout the first half of the season, we have seen Bernard struggle with his memory, jumping between dream and memory and reality, struggling with time, unsure what time he's actually living in. He is really unsure of reality itself. We've seen Bernard change physically as well, so the wound on his head at one point disappeared. We've also seen him have uncontrollable shaking movements. Whilst initially I assumed this was the cognitive lock, which we've seen before because of the leaking brain juice, could this have been the same symptom as what James Delos had, as James Delos was struggling with reality and he started shaking and repeating words as well? So with these points combined, now let's add in the opening scene of episode 6. It really does add even more credence to this theory. So the intro scene in episode 6, we see Dolores being interviewed by Arnold, or so we thought. It turns out we see Dolores doing a fidelity test on Arnold himself. So the same test that William did to James Delos unsuccessfully for 30 years. So with the addition of this new scene and our previous theories, where does it leave us? Well, it really does add the extra weight to the general idea that we're seeing multiple Bernards, and that one of them, in the future timeline, the Carl Strand timeline, the one where Bernard wakes up on the beach, is perhaps Bernard's awakening with Arnold's consciousness. So we've seen multiple times this very delusional Bernard in the Carl Strand timeline. Much different behaviour than we've seen when Bernard is speaking with Elsie, when he's speaking with Charlotte Hale, all the time shortly after the revolution. So that leads to the question, when does this occur? And who does it? And what's the motive? So this part gets a little bit more convoluted with an additional couple more timelines here. I believe we have 3 character story arcs in the same timeline. So the timeline a few days after the revolution, but prior to Carl Strand arriving. They'll all be colliding, I believe, over the next episode or 2. So that is Bernard and Elsie, we've seen them in the cradle, Ashley and Charlotte Hale, they're in Nemessa, and Dolores and Teddy have just arrived in Nemessa as well. So from those characters, who is still around in the future timeline? So once again, that Carl Strand timeline. Ashley and Charlotte are definitely there, and a new Bernard is. So my current theory is that Bernard and Elsie perish over the next episode or 2. Perhaps this is done by Dolores, or another idea that I prefer is that Ford forces Bernard to kill Elsie. Not that I want Elsie to die. Then Bernard is really distraught with what he has done and that unable to control himself. He's still at the will of Ford. So at that point, Bernard destroys the cradle and puts an end to Ford once and for all. Something dramatic definitely does occur with those characters, as we've seen Charlotte mention when she met Bernard in the future timeline, so the Carl Strand timeline, Charlotte being very surprised when she meets him and mentioning she didn't think that he had it in him. And what is she referring to there? Had it in him to survive something? Speaking of Charlotte, we also have seen in trailer for episode 7, Charlotte finds multiple host Bernards in a host storage location. So we also see that Charlotte switches on one of those hosts, but I'm unsure as to what timeline this all fits into. I can only see that it fits into a future scenario that we're not yet familiar with along the Carl Strand timeline, as Charlotte's behaviour towards Bernard never suggests that she believes he is a host. So now the final question. Who would rebuild Bernard? Who would put Arnold's consciousness into a Bernard host? Of course, the most obvious here would be Ford. He has the knowledge and he has the motive. He has the motive of guilt of what happened to his friend. He could also use Dolores as a pawn for a fidelity test. Next most logical would be Dolores herself. She has the motive, revenge. Could she use Bernard or Arnold as a pawn or a way for her to learn more? But unsure if she could do this alone as well. She may require assistance from Ford or some Delos engineers, so that might be a bit of a struggle. Okay, now let's move on to the full conspiracies with the tinfoil hats on around trying to figure out who would rebuild Bernard. Another option. Let's assume I'm way off with all these theories so far. And what we see in the trailer around Charlotte Hale and Delos finding the Bernard host, and that they actually recreate a new one. But that doesn't really make any sense. What would be the purpose for that? Also, we see Ashley Stubbs witness the whole scenario unfold also. Neither Ashley Stubbs or Charlotte Hale behave in a way that would suggest the knowledge of Bernard being a host in the timeline so far. An even crazier option on top of that would be, so they do find out that Bernard is a host, but the thing is, Dolores manages to take over and find the weapon, and the weapon is, once again, a whole bunch of hosts. So maybe it is a whole bunch of Delos hosts. So at this point, Charlotte Hale, Ashley Stubbs, and Bernard are all hosts working for Dolores herself, and they're just bringing Carl Strand into the Mesa as a trap. I will leave with one final theory. Another option I found on a Reddit thread around the initial scene in episode 6 and its meaning. This theory is a fantastic idea. So we've been looking at the Arnold-Dolores scenes wrong for the entire second season and also for the entire first season. Have all those scenes with Arnold and Dolores actually been fidelity testing by Ford to import Arnold's mind into Bernard's body for many, many years? Whilst at the same time, William was also trying to do the same thing with James Delos. So Dolores will be a perfect helper to replay scenarios for Arnold with the fidelity test. Could this even have been a project Ford has been working on for years? So trying to restore his friend's mind in Bernard's host. And not just have a host version of his friend, actually have his friend back. But anyway, I shall leave this here. I hope you enjoyed some of those theories. I had a lot of fun thinking about them over the last few days. So let me know your thoughts. Always interested to find out them, and also pretty excited to find out what happens next episode. So leave me some feedback below. Thumbs up if you like this theories video, and subscribe for future content around Westworld and a few other things coming up as well. So until next time, this is Mesh, and I'll see you later.